The town calls this land trash and they call me a fool. But they're about to learn you never count out a man with a mission.
The town laughed when the veteran walked into the hardware store with a German shepherd at his side and asked for 40 bags of compost, 12 fence posts, and a roll of barbed wire for a piece of land everyone in the valley called trash. Conrad Hollister was leaning against the counter, and he turned around slow, smiling that smile rich men smile when they want to wound you in public. And he said loud enough for every customer to hear, "Mister, you must be the only fool left in 3 counties who'd put $1 into the Barnaby place." Jax Harlan did not answer. The dog at his side did not move. Outside, on the radio in his truck, the National Weather Service was issuing its first warning about the storm coming down out of the Gulf of Alaska, the storm that was going to teach this valley what it had forgotten about, forgotten men. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold came up through the floorboards of the old Ford F-250 like something alive, like something that had been waiting all night for him to lower his guard, and Jax Harlan opened his eyes in the steel blue light of pre-dawn and felt every one of his 38 years settle into the bones of his back and shoulders and the long-healed scar tissue that ran from his right hip down into the meat of his thigh. He did not move for a long moment. He simply lay there beneath the heavy wool surplus blanket with his breath ghosting upward in slow pale clouds, listening to the sounds of the orchard the way a man listens to a battlefield at first light, cataloguing each one, sorting them into what mattered and what did not. The wind was moving through the dead branches of the apple trees outside, and that was the sound that always took the longest to read. The sound that the broken part of his mind never quite stopped misidentifying. Because dead branches in November wind made a dry rattling click against one another that was, if a man was honest with himself, exactly the sound of small arms fire heard from a long distance away across hard-packed earth. He let the sound wash over him. He let it pass through him. He counted the seconds the way the Veterans Affairs counselor in Boise had told him to count them. 3 years ago now, in that office, with the cheap fluorescent lighting and the wilted spider plant on the file cabinet, and after the seconds passed and the sound was still only what it was, only branches and only wind, he let himself sit up. Smokey was already awake. She had probably been awake for an hour. The German shepherd was lying in her own blanket nest in the passenger footwell, her thick double coat blending with the grey dawn, her amber eyes already fixed on his face with that steady ancient patience she had carried with her ever since the field hospital in Kandahar, ever since the morning the army medical officer had told him she would not work again, and he had told the army medical officer that this was not a problem because she was coming home with him, regardless of what any paperwork said about it. "Morning." "Sergeant," he said quietly, and his voice was hoarse from sleep and from the cold, and Smokey's heavy tail thumped exactly twice against the rubber floor mat in acknowledgement. He pulled on his boots. He pulled on the worn military surplus jacket, whose cuffs had begun to fray at the wrists and along the inside of the elbows, the jacket he had worn in 3 countries and 4 winters, and which still smelled faintly on cold mornings, of wood smoke and of something older that he had never been able to name. He stepped down out of the cab of the truck, and the air bit into his lungs, sharp and clean and tasting of pine smoke from somewhere far down the valley, and of frost on dead grass, and of the iron-hard November ground beneath his boots. The orchard stretched out around him in the slow grey light, and he stood for a long moment with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets and looked at it the way he had looked at it every morning for the 11 days he had owned it. 80 acres. 312 apple trees by his count, of which perhaps 100 were still alive in any meaningful sense, and perhaps 40 more could be brought back if a man was patient and stubborn and had nothing in his life that mattered more than the work. The trees that were dead stood like blackened skeletons in the hard frost-greyed grass, their branches twisted by 30 years of nobody pruning them, their bark split open in long pale wounds where the winters had got at them and finished what the long abandonment had started. The fences were down on the east side and rotted out on the south side, and existed in name only along the property line that ran up against the Callaway place. The barn at the top of the rise had a hole in its roof a man could put a small truck through. The farmhouse was uninhabitable. The well was good. The well was the only thing on the property. The previous owner's nephew had told him that still worked. Jax had paid $41,000 for it. He had paid it in cash in a small windowless office above the title company on Main Street, with money that represented the entire balance of what he had been able to put back together after his wife and her lawyer had finished with him. The check had cleaned him out. The check had also bought him the only piece of earth in this country he had served in 3 wars and bled in 2 of them, that belonged in the eyes of the law to him and to him alone. He walked out into the orchard with Smokey moving in the dim half-step pattern at his left heel that she had been moving in for 9 years now. The frost crunched beneath his boots. His breath ghosted ahead of him. He stopped at the 3rd row, 4th tree, the one with the deep cleft in its trunk where some long ago lightning strike had laid the heartwood open like a wound, and he laid one scarred hand flat against the bark and stood there a moment, just breathing. The wife's name had been Marisa. He did not say her name out loud. He had not said her name out loud for almost 4 years now, not since the night in the hotel room in Spokane, when he had finally signed the papers, and his lawyer had asked him if he wanted to add a verbal affirmation for the record, and he had said no, and walked out into the parking lot and sat in his truck for 40 minutes before he had been able to start the engine. But the name was always there. The name was always there in the way a stitch is there in a piece of cloth that has been sewn back together after a tear, and the cloth holds and the cloth keeps doing its job, but the stitch is there, and the man who runs his thumb over it knows the cloth was once torn open, and that the tear is what made the stitch necessary in the first place. She had stayed faithful through the first deployment, she had stayed faithful through the second deployment, she had stayed faithful, by her own account in the deposition his lawyer had taken, through approximately the first 8 months of the 3rd deployment. The 3rd deployment was the one that had ended with the IED on the road outside the village, whose name he could no longer pronounce, and the field hospital and Smokey on the gurney beside him with her hindquarter bandaged and her amber eyes fixed on his face the entire time. He had come home in a wheelchair. He had come home to a house in Coeur d'Alene that no longer felt like his house, with a wife who no longer felt like his wife. And over the next 18 months the marriage had hollowed out from the inside the way a tree hollows out around a wound, and at the end of those 18 months she had served him papers and her lawyer had moved with a speed that suggested certain conversations had been happening for some time before Jax had been informed they were happening at all. The house had been in her name. He had signed it over 5 years before at her father's recommendation for tax reasons that her father had explained at length over a Thanksgiving dinner. And he had signed because he was about to ship out, and he had trusted her, and trust, the lawyer in Spokane had eventually explained to him, was not a category recognized by the state of Idaho when the question of marital property came up before a judge. She had got the house, she had got the savings, she had got the car, she had got the life insurance policy whose beneficiary had never been updated. She had got, in the end, almost everything that a life of 15 years of marriage had accumulated, and what she had not got, the lawyers had taken in fees, and what was left at the end was the truck and the dog, and a single duffel bag, and a wedding photograph that Jax could not, for reasons he had never fully understood and never tried to articulate, throw away. The wedding photograph rode in the glove compartment of the F-250. It rode there inside a brown manila envelope that he never opened. He knew it was there. Smokey knew it was there, in whatever way Smokey knew the things she knew, because she sometimes laid her chin on the dashboard above the glove compartment and looked at it for long minutes at a time without moving. The photograph was of 2 young people standing on the courthouse steps in Spokane in a summer 10 years gone, and the young man in the photograph wore a Class A uniform and the young woman wore a white sundress, and they were looking at each other in a way that the man Jax was now did not entirely recognize as belonging to him. He kept the photograph because to throw it away would have been to admit that the young man on those courthouse steps had also died on that road outside that village, and Jax was not ready to admit that. He was not sure he ever would be. He stood now with his hand on the cleft tree and let the wind move through the orchard around him. He let the cold work its way into his bones. He listened to the small sounds of Smokey breathing at his heel, the steady controlled in and out of an animal that had learned a long time ago how to rest at full alertness, how to stand watch on her own breath. The town did not want him here. The town had made that clear in the 11 days since he had closed on the property. The clerk at the title company had been polite in the way professionals are polite when they have already decided you're not their kind of person. The man who delivered the propane to the small camper trailer he was setting up by the barn had not made eye contact. The woman behind the counter at the feed store had asked him 3 separate times whether he was sure he could pay before she would ring up his order. And then there was Hollister. Conrad Hollister owned the 420 acres directly to the north of the Barnaby place. Conrad Hollister had inherited those 420 acres from his father, who had inherited them from his father, and Conrad Hollister had spent the last 6 years trying to acquire the Barnaby orchard for a price that the previous owner's nephew had described to Jax in the title office on the day of the closing as an insult dressed up in a suit and tie. Conrad Hollister wanted the orchard for a hunting lodge development. Conrad Hollister was a man who had never served, never lost anything that mattered, never spent a winter sleeping in a vehicle, and who had the perfect serene confidence of a man who had always been told by everyone in his life that whatever he wanted was reasonable and that whatever he did not want did not deserve to exist. Conrad Hollister had driven up the access road 3 times in the past week. He had never gotten out of his truck. He had simply sat there, with the engine running, looking out across the dead orchard at Jax working in it, and the diesel of his idling truck had drifted on the air in a way that Jax had spent a long time training himself not to react to, because diesel exhaust on cold air had been the smell of the convoy that had been hit, and the smell still belonged, in the broken part of his mind, to that morning and that road, and the half-second before everything had gone white. Smokey knew about Hollister. Smokey had taken the measure of him on the first visit, the way she took the measure of every human being who crossed onto the property, and she had made her assessment with a single low rumble in the deep of her chest that Jax had learned, over the long years of their partnership, was her professional opinion that the man in question was not to be trusted. She had not changed that assessment. She had not needed to. Jax took his hand off the cleft tree. He looked up the row of dead and dying trees toward the rise where the old barn stood with its broken roof against the grey sky, and beyond the barn to the long stretch of land that ran down to the creek, and beyond the creek to the dark line of pine forest that climbed up the shoulder of the mountain, and he let his eyes travel slowly across all of it, the way a man surveys a landscape he is going to have to defend. He had bought the orchard for one reason. He had bought it because in the 11 months since the divorce had finalized, he had gone slowly mad in motel rooms and in his truck, and in the small studio apartment in Boise that the VA had helped him secure for 90 days before the lease had run out, and he had not been able to renew it. He had gone slowly mad with the absence of mission. He had gone slowly mad with the silence. He had gone slowly mad with the knowledge that the country he had served had a system, a careful and well-funded system, for processing men like him out the back door of itself and into a category of statistic that no one in any office anywhere ever had to look at again. The orchard was a mission. The orchard was 80 acres of mission. The trees needed pruning, the soil needed feeding, the fences needed rebuilding, the barn needed re-roofing, the old root cellar that the title office had mentioned in passing needed clearing and reinforcing, and somewhere in the middle of all of that work was the possibility that a man could go to bed at night tired in his body, in a way that would let him sleep through until morning without the dreams. He had not slept through until morning yet. He had gotten close, twice, in the 11 nights he had been on the property. Twice was more than 0, and Jax Harlan was a man who had learned in a place a long way from this one that progress was always counted in fractions, and that a man who was honest about his fractions could survive anything a war or a country could put in front of him. He turned from the cleft tree and began to walk back toward the truck. Smokey moved at his heel. The frost crunched. The wind moved through the dead branches with that dry rattling sound. Somewhere down in the valley, a long way off, a single dog was barking, and somewhere closer, in the high pines on the slope above the orchard, a raven was calling, and Jax Harlan walked through the cold grey morning toward the work of the day with the German shepherd at his side, and no plan for the rest of his life beyond the work itself. He was going to bring this orchard back. He was going to bring it back tree by tree and row by row. And he did not know yet that he was going to need it to bring him back too, and he did not know yet that there were 80 acres of mission still ahead of him that had nothing at all to do with apples. The hardware store on Main Street was called Tuck's, and had been called Tuck's since 1947, and it smelled of the same things hardware stores have always smelled of, which is to say cut lumber and machine oil and the particular dusty metal smell of nails kept in open wooden bins. And Jax Harlan stood at the counter with his list folded in half between two scarred fingers and waited for the man behind the register to finish his conversation with the customer ahead of him. The customer ahead of him was an older woman in a green wool coat. The older woman was buying a single box of stove pellets and a roll of weather stripping, and she was paying for them slowly out of a worn leather coin purse that she had to balance on the counter with one hand while she counted with the other. Her hands were unsteady. Her hands were unsteady in the specific way that the hands of older women become unsteady when the years have begun to take certain things from them, and they have not yet decided how angry to be about it. The man behind the register was Roy Tucker. Roy Tucker was the grandson of the original Tuck. Roy Tucker had a face that had been carved by 60-some Idaho winters into a permanent expression of cautious neutrality. And he was waiting for the older woman to finish her counting with the patience of a man who had been waiting for older women to finish their counting in this same store for 40 years. The older woman had a boy with her. The boy was perhaps 11 years old. The boy was standing very close to the older woman's coat, with one small hand fisted into the green wool of her hem. And the boy was looking at the floor in the way children look at the floor when they have learned, recently and badly, that adult conversations are not always safe to be in the room for. Smokey saw the boy. Smokey saw the boy in the first second. The boy and the woman had walked into the store, and her ears, which had been at neutral attention, came forward by a precise quarter-inch, and her amber eyes fixed on the back of the boy's small bowed head in the way she fixed her eyes on things that mattered to her. And she did not look away. Jax noticed. Jax did not say anything. He simply stood at the counter with his list folded between his fingers and let the older woman finish her counting, and let the dog assess what the dog needed to assess. And the long moment held, and the cold November light came through the front windows of Tuck's hardware store and lay in pale rectangles across the worn linoleum floor. The bell above the front door rang. Conrad Hollister walked in. Hollister was wearing a forest green Carhartt jacket that had never seen actual work, and beneath the jacket a pressed flannel shirt in a tasteful red and black plaid, and beneath the flannel shirt a thermal undershirt that showed at the collar in a clean white line. He was 46 years old. He had the soft, prosperous fullness in the cheeks of a man who had eaten well his entire life and had never had to worry about whether he was going to keep eating well. He was carrying a paper coffee cup from the espresso shop, 2 doors down, and the cup had his name written on it in marker, and he was the kind of man who looked at the writing of his own name on a coffee cup with the small, pleased expression of someone confirming a fact about the world that he liked. He saw Jax. He saw Smokey. He saw the older woman and the boy at the counter. He took the entire room in with a single sweeping glance, and then he made the calculation that men like him make in those situations, and he raised his voice exactly 1 degree above conversational, which was the degree at which everyone in the store would be able to hear him without him appearing to be performing for them. "Roy," he said warmly, "tell me you finally got those bear-proof trash receptacles in, the ones I ordered." "They came in Tuesday, Conrad," said Roy Tucker, without looking up from the older woman's coin purse. "Outstanding," said Hollister. And then he turned, slow and easy, with the coffee cup still in his hand, and he looked directly at Jax for the first time. "Mr. Harlan." Jax did not answer. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Hollister said. Smiling, Conrad Hollister. Hollister Land and Cattle. "We're your neighbours to the north." Jax inclined his head approximately 1 degree. It was not a nod. It was the acknowledgement of a fact. "I've been meaning to drop by," Hollister said. "Welcome wagon, you understand. I tried a couple of times this past week, but you always seem to be working." He took a sip of his coffee. "I admire that industriousness. Lord knows that property could use some industriousness." He let the sentence hang in the air for a moment, and then he turned the smile up another half degree and added, with perfect public timing, "Mister, you must be the only fool left in 3 counties who'd put $1 into the Barnaby place." The older woman's hands stopped counting. The boy looked up from the floor. Roy Tucker's face did not change, but something in his eyes went very still, the way a deer's eyes go still in the half-second before it decides whether to bolt or to freeze. Jax did not move. He did not move for what was, by his own internal count, 3 full seconds. 3 seconds, in the place he had learned to count seconds, was a lifetime. 3 seconds was the length of a whole engagement decision tree. 3 seconds was the time it took for a heart rate to climb or to settle, for a breathing pattern to be brought back under conscious control, for a hand that had moved instinctively toward the place a sidearm used to ride, to be told gently and firmly that the sidearm was not there anymore, and was not going to be needed. After the 3 seconds, Jax laid his list flat on the counter, in front of Roy Tucker, with the same care he had once used to lay out range cards, and he said in a voice that was completely level and completely without heat, "When you have a minute, Roy, I'll need everything on this list, and I'll pay cash." Roy Tucker looked down at the list. Roy Tucker looked up at Jax. Roy Tucker said, "Yes, sir." Smokey had shifted, in the long 3 seconds, by perhaps an inch. She had moved her left front paw forward and put her weight into her shoulders the way she did when the situation in front of her had begun to require it of her, and her amber eyes had moved off the back of the boy's bowed head and were now fixed, with a calm and absolute professionalism, on Conrad Hollister's centre mass. She had not made a sound. She did not need to make a sound. The dog was a fact that Hollister was going to have to factor into his afternoon, and Hollister, to his credit, was a man capable of recognizing facts when they were standing in front of him with amber eyes. Hollister kept smiling. The smile was a little thinner now. "Anyway, Mr. Harlan," he said, "I did want to mention my offer on the orchard still stands. I bumped it up another 5% last week. In fact, in light of the time of year and what I expect the winter is going to do to a property in that condition, I had my office mail you the revised paperwork. Did you receive it?" "I did," said Jax. "And my answer is the same." "Mr. Harlan," said Hollister, and now there was a small note of patient indulgence in his voice, the note a man uses when he is explaining to a child why the stove is hot. "I don't think you fully appreciate what's coming. The forecast for this winter is rough. The Old Farmer's Almanac is calling for the worst November since 1996. That orchard is going to take you apart. The smart move, the move a sensible man in your position would make, is to take the offer, walk away with something in your pocket, and let somebody who has the resources to do something with that land actually do something with it." He took another sip of his coffee. "I'm trying to help you here." The older woman at the counter was watching now. She had stopped pretending not to. She was watching with a clear, unwavering attention that Jax recognized as the attention of someone who had been on her own side of a conversation like this one and had not forgotten it. The boy was watching too. The boy had let go of her coat hem. Smokey had not moved her eyes off Hollister's centre mass. Jax said, very quietly, "I appreciate the offer. Mr. Hollister, my answer is the same." There was a long pause. Hollister set his coffee cup down on the counter with a soft, small click. "Suit yourself," he said. He turned and walked out of the store, and the bell above the door rang again on his way out, and the silence that he left behind him was thick enough to walk on. The older woman cleared her throat. "Roy," she said, "I've got my pellets and my weather stripping. I'll settle up now and let this man get his order in." She handed Roy Tucker a folded $10 bill and a pair of singles, and Roy Tucker rang it up without saying a word, and she dropped the change into her coin purse and snapped it closed. And then she turned to Jax with the boy still close at her side, and she looked at him directly for the first time. She had pale grey eyes. She had a face that had been beautiful in some long-ago decade, and had, in this decade, become something better than beautiful, which is to say a face that had been earned. She was perhaps 68 years old. There was a small American flag pin on the collar of her green wool coat, and beside the American flag pin was a smaller pin in the shape of a star, the kind of star that Jax had seen on the doors of houses all his life, and had learned by the age of 12 what it meant. "Young man," she said, "my name is Eleanor Calloway. My place is the 70 acres that runs along the east boundary of yours. The white house with the tin roof you can see from your barn." She paused. "My husband's name was Samuel Calloway. He served in Korea. He came home in 1953, and he lived another 41 years, and there was not one day of those 41 years that this valley made easy on him. I wanted you to know that I saw what just happened in here, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town agrees with Mr. Hollister about what kind of land your land is, or about what kind of man you are." Jax did not trust his voice for a moment. He said, when the moment had passed, "Ma'am, thank you." Eleanor Calloway nodded. Once. She looked down at the boy. "This is my grandson," she said. "Wyatt. He's staying with me through the winter. His mother is my daughter. She's going through a hard season." The boy looked up at Jax. The boy had his grandmother's pale grey eyes. The boy had a small bruise on the side of his jaw that was at the yellow-green stage of healing. The stage where a bruise tells you that something happened maybe 10 days ago and has not yet finished telling its story. "Hello?" "Wyatt," said Jax. Wyatt looked at Jax. Then Wyatt looked at Smokey. Smokey's amber eyes moved off Hollister's vacated airspace and onto the boy with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, and the dog's heavy tail thumped, exactly once, against the worn linoleum of Tuck's hardware store floor. "Is your dog friendly?" Wyatt said. His voice was very small. "She's a soldier," said Jax. "She's friendly to people she decides are friendly. You can put your hand out, palm down, and let her come to you." Wyatt looked at his grandmother. Eleanor Calloway nodded. The boy let go of her coat completely, and he took one small step forward, and he extended his small thin hand palm down towards Smokey the way he had been told. And Smokey considered him for one long moment with that ancient patient gaze, and then she stepped forward herself the requisite single step, and she lowered her great noble head, and she pressed her cold black nose with absolute gentleness into the back of the boy's offered hand. Wyatt's whole body changed. It was the sort of small change that only somebody who had spent a lot of time watching broken creatures decide whether to keep being broken would have caught. His shoulders lowered by a fraction of an inch, his breathing slowed and deepened, the small fist that had been holding so tight to his grandmother's hem opened up, and the fingers spread, and the boy reached up with his other hand and laid it, slow and reverent, on the broad, strong skull of the dog. Smokey stood for it. Smokey stood for it the way she had once stood for a 4-year-old girl on a base in Germany, whose father had come home in a flag-draped box 6 weeks before, the way she had stood for an old man in a VA hospital whose own dog had been dead for 10 years. Smokey stood for it, and Smokey's amber eyes closed halfway, in that particular slow blink that meant, in the language Jax had learned, that the dog had identified a creature in front of her that needed something, and that she was prepared to give it. Jax did not say anything. The radio behind the counter, which had been playing quiet country music for the entire encounter, switched over to the top of the hour news at that exact moment, and the National Weather Service voice came on, with the kind of flat institutional calm those voices have when they are about to deliver something the listener should be paying attention to. A storm system, the voice said, was building in the Gulf of Alaska. The system was being tracked by the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service jointly, which the voice noted was unusual for this time of year. The system was projected to make landfall along the Oregon and Washington coasts within 72 to 96 hours, and was projected to push inland across the northern Rockies as a major winter weather event with sustained winds of 50 to 70 miles per hour, snow accumulations of 18 to 30 inches at lower elevations, and temperatures dropping into single digits by Sunday night. Residents of affected counties, the voice said, should be making preparations now. The radio clicked back over to country music. Eleanor Calloway and Jax Harlan looked at each other across the worn counter of Tuck's hardware store. "Mr. Harlan," she said quietly. "Ma'am, that sounds like a serious storm." "It does." "Ma'am, are you ready for it?" "On that property." Jax thought about the answer. He thought about the truck and the camper trailer and the orchard and the old root cellar he had not yet had a chance to clear out, and he thought about the 80 acres of mission ahead of him, and he thought about the boy with the bruise on his jaw and the woman with the gold star pin on her collar standing in front of him in the cold November light, and he thought about Conrad Hollister's smile. "I'm going to be," he said. "Good," said Eleanor Calloway. She put her small hand briefly on Wyatt's shoulder. "We should go," she said. "Mr. Tucker has work to do, and so does Mr. Harlan." "Ma'am," said Jax, "before you go." She turned. "That cellar on your property," he said. "Your husband's cellar. Is it still in working condition?" She looked at him for a moment. "It is," she said. "Then, ma'am," said Jax, "if that storm comes in the way they're saying it's going to, you and the boy come up to my place. The Barnaby cellar is in worse shape than yours, but I can have it ready by Saturday. Either way, you don't ride that storm out alone in that white house. Not at your age, not with a child." Eleanor Calloway looked at him for a long, careful moment, and the grey light of November in Tuck's hardware store fell across her face. And after the long, careful moment was over, she said, "Mr. Harlan, I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking, ma'am." She nodded. Once. She and the boy walked toward the door. At the door, the boy turned back. "Bye?" "Smoky," he said. The dog's heavy tail thumped. Once. Against the linoleum. The bell above the door rang. They were gone. Jack stood at the counter of Tuck's hardware store with his list in front of him, and the dog at his heel, and the radio playing quiet country music behind the register, and he did not move for a long moment. He was thinking about the boy's bruise. He was thinking about the gold star pin. He was thinking about the 72 to 96 hours, and the 18 to 30 inches and the wind speeds. And he was thinking about Conrad Hollister's smile. And he was thinking about an orchard he had bought 11 days ago with the last money he had to his name. The mission had just changed. The mission had just gotten a lot bigger. "Roy," he said. "Mr. Harlan, add to that list 2 more rolls of plastic sheeting, 50 pounds of rice if you carry it. If you don't, point me to who does. 40 cans of soup, mixed varieties, 20 pounds of beans, dry, whatever batteries you've got, 2 more lanterns, 5 gallons of kerosene, and whatever generator you have on the floor that I can hook to a small house in an emergency." Roy Tucker looked at the list. Roy Tucker looked at Jax. Roy Tucker, for the first time in the encounter, allowed something that was almost a smile to move at the corner of his weathered mouth. "Going to need a bigger truck, Mr. Harlan." "I'll make 2 trips." "Yes, sir," said Roy Tucker. And he started writing. The community centre on Pine Street had been built in 1962 by the Lions Club and the Volunteer Fire Department working together over a single long summer, and it had served as the place in town where bake sales, PTA meetings, wedding receptions, and the occasional county-mandated public information meeting were held. And on the Thursday evening before the storm, Jax Harlan walked through its double front doors at 6:55 in the evening with Smokey at his left heel, and a folded list of Valley addresses in his shirt pocket, and the still distinct sense that he was walking into a kind of engagement for which his training had not entirely prepared him. The fluorescent lights in the community centre hummed with that same hollow institutional electric buzz he had heard in every government building he had ever set foot in. The buzz of the truck stop in Montana the previous winter, and the VA office in Boise, and the courthouse hallway outside the family law division in Spokane. And the buzz settled into the marrow of his bones the way it always did, and he let it settle, and he kept moving. There were perhaps 60 people in the community centre. There were folding metal chairs set up in 8 rows of 10 across the linoleum floor. There was a long folding table at the front of the room, behind which sat 3 men and 1 woman, all of them in the kind of khaki and windbreaker uniform that meant county government, and behind the table was a pull-down screen onto which somebody had projected a slightly out-of-focus weather map of the Northern Rockies, with a red curving arrow pointing at the valley. Jax took a seat in the back row. Smokey lay down at his feet and put her chin on her paws and her amber eyes on the table at the front of the room. He saw Eleanor Calloway, 3 rows ahead of him, with Wyatt beside her in a too-big winter coat. He saw Roy Tucker from the hardware store. He saw the woman from the feed store. He saw the propane delivery man. He saw, near the front, Conrad Hollister, who was wearing the same Carhartt jacket and the same flannel shirt, and was sitting next to a younger man in an identical Carhartt jacket who had the same soft, prosperous fullness around the eyes and who was almost certainly his son. The man at the center of the long folding table tapped the microphone twice, and the buzz of the room subsided. "Good evening," he said. "My name is Carl Whitaker. I'm the County Emergency Management Coordinator. Thank you all for coming out tonight on short notice. I'm going to go through the situation with you, and then we're going to take some questions, and then we'll wrap up. I'll try to be brief." Carl Whitaker was a man in his middle 50s with a neat grey moustache and the careful neutral courtesy of a public servant who had spent his career trying not to be a story. He was not a cruel man. Jax could read that in him within 90 seconds. He was simply a man whose job was to read prepared statements off a clipboard and to answer questions within the boundaries of established county protocol, and what Jax was going to need from him was outside those boundaries. Carl Whitaker walked the room through the storm. He used the projected map. He used the words significant weather event and potential power disruption, an advisory in effect. He explained, with the patient bland confidence of his office, that the county had stockpiles of road salt, and that the road crews would be working through the weekend, and that the Red Cross would be opening a shelter at the high school gymnasium if conditions warranted it, and that residents should make sure they had a few days of supplies on hand, and a charged cell phone and a battery-powered radio. Jax listened. He listened the way a man who had once sat through pre-mission briefings listens, which is to say he listened for what was being said and for what was not being said. And what was not being said was loud. Carl Whitaker did not say that the high school gymnasium had 32-year-old electrical wiring that had been red-flagged in the last county inspection. Carl Whitaker did not say that the county had 2 snowplows and one of them was overdue for transmission work. Carl Whitaker did not say that the storm being projected was at the upper end of what the National Weather Service had ever issued for this part of the country in November, and that the Old Farmer's Almanac figure of 1996 Hollister had quoted in the hardware store referred to a storm that had killed 11 people in 3 counties. Carl Whitaker took questions. A man near the front asked about road closures. Carl Whitaker answered. A woman in the middle asked about livestock. Carl Whitaker answered. Conrad Hollister asked, with a small amused half-smile, whether the county would be deploying its salt trucks up the private access roads off Route 14, and Carl Whitaker answered, with a small apologetic shake of his head, that private roads were the responsibility of the property owners. Conrad Hollister nodded as though he had known this all along, and had only asked the question to confirm it for everyone in the room. Jax stood up. He stood up slowly, because Smokey needed half a second to come to her feet beside him, and because the act of standing up in this kind of room was, for him, something that had to be done with full awareness of the shape it would make in the social space. Carl Whitaker looked at him. "Sir," said Carl Whitaker. Question. "Mr. Whitaker," said Jax. "My name is Jax Harlan. I bought the Barnaby Orchard 11 days ago. I'm the new owner of those 80 acres south of the Callaway place." There was a small ripple of recognition through the back rows of the room. Heads turned. Nobody said anything out loud. "Mr. Harlan," said Whitaker. "Welcome to the valley." "Thank you, sir. My question is this. The storm you're describing is going to put down 1.5 feet of snow at 4,000 feet, and at our elevation it's going to be worse than that. It's going to come in with sustained winds of 50 to 70 and gusts that the NWS isn't projecting yet because their model doesn't have good data for our terrain. The power is going to go out. It's going to go out within the first 6 hours of the storm hitting, and it's going to stay out for somewhere between 3 and 7 days, depending on what falls onto the lines. The high school gymnasium that you've identified as your shelter is on the same Idaho power grid as the rest of town, and it's going to lose power at the same time everything else does. And the gymnasium's backup generator, according to the county inspection report from last March, needs a part that hasn't been ordered yet. The room had gone very quiet. Carl Whitaker was looking at Jax with an expression that had passed through 3 different feelings in the last 6 seconds and had landed on something close to professional alarm. "Mr. Harlan," he said carefully, I'm not sure where you're getting some of that information. It's all in the public record. Sir, the inspection reports are filed at the county clerk's office. I read them yesterday. I see. My point isn't to embarrass anybody, Jax said quietly. My point is that the plan you've laid out tonight is going to leave families in this valley sitting in cold houses for somewhere between 72 and 168 hours. And a percentage of those families are going to be elderly, and a percentage of those families are going to have small children, and a percentage of them are going to have medical needs that they have not told their neighbours about, and that nobody is going to know about until somebody finds them. I've put together a list. There are 47 addresses on it. I drove every one of them today. 47 addresses where the resident is over 75, or where there's a documented medical condition, or where there's a household with a child under 12. I want to go through those addresses with you tonight, sir, and I want the names of the volunteer fire department guys who can reach each one of them before the storm comes in. And I want a backup plan for the ones the volunteer fire can't reach. Mr. Harlan, said Whitaker, I appreciate the initiative. I really do. But the county has protocols. We have established protocols for an event like this. Yes, sir. I read those too. The protocols assume the high school holds power. The protocols assume Route 14 stays passable for emergency vehicles. The protocols assume that the cellular network stays up for 90% of the affected area. None of those three assumptions is going to hold past hour 8 of this storm, sir. And what I'm asking you is whether the county is willing to pre-position resources at 3 or 4 locations in the valley before the storm hits, instead of trying to deploy them through it. Mr. Harlan. Sir, let's take this offline. After the meeting, I'll be glad to look at your list. There was a small, clear sound from the front of the room. Conrad Hollister was laughing. It was not a loud laugh. It was a small, private, appreciative chuckle. The kind a man makes to his son in a public meeting when he has just witnessed something he intends to enjoy talking about later. He was shaking his head slowly from side to side. Hollister stood up. Carl, he said warmly, I think what we're hearing tonight is a perfect example of how good intentions can get a little out ahead of good information. Mr. Harlan is new to the valley. Mr. Harlan is, as a number of us here tonight know, going through a difficult personal time. I think we should all appreciate his concern for our community, but I also think the county knows its job and we should let the county do its job. He paused, he smiled at the room. We've ridden out winters here for 140 years. We're going to ride out this one too. There was a small nervous laugh from somewhere in the middle rows. There was also, Jax noticed, no laugh from Eleanor Calloway, and no laugh from Roy Tucker, and no laugh from a thin grey-bearded man in the second row, whom Jax had not seen before but who, Jax could see now, was wearing a Vietnam Veterans of America cap, and was looking at Conrad Hollister with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. Carl Whitaker cleared his throat. Folks, he said, let's keep this constructive. Mr. Harlan, like I said, after the meeting I'd be glad to look at your list. Anyone else have a question? The meeting moved on. It moved on in the way meetings move on when something has been said in them that the room is not equipped to handle, which is to say it moved on by pretending the thing had not been said. 3 more questions were asked. 3 more answers were given. Carl Whitaker thanked everyone for coming. The folding chairs scraped on the linoleum. People got up. People put on their coats. People filed out into the cold November parking lot. Jack stood by the back wall with Smokey at his heel and waited. Eleanor Calloway came back to him through the thinning crowd, with Wyatt holding her hand. She did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked at him, and her pale grey eyes held his, and, after the moment, she said, very quietly, My husband would have liked you. Mr. Harlan. Thank you, ma'am. My husband would have stood up exactly like that, and the room would have done exactly the same thing to him as it just did to you. It is one of the small great cruelties of this country, Mr. Harlan, that the people who would die for it are routinely told to sit down and be quiet by the people who never would. Jax did not trust his voice. She squeezed his arm. Once, briefly, I'll bring Wyatt up Saturday morning, she said. Before the storm. I'll bring blankets and the canned goods I have in my pantry. You tell me what else you need. Yes, ma'am. And, Mr. Harlan, ma'am, thank you for that list. She and the boy walked away through the doors into the parking lot. Carl Whitaker came over to Jax with a tired, careful expression on his face. He had Jax's list in his hand. Jax had not given it to him. Somebody had picked it up off the floor where Jax had dropped it during the standing up, and had given it to Whitaker. Mr. Harlan, Whitaker said, walk out with me. Talk to me about this. They walked out together. Smokey moved at Jax's heel. The cold November air outside the community centre had a sharp, clean edge on it that meant the storm was already changing. The upper atmosphere was already pulling the last of the autumn out of the valley. Whitaker stopped beside his county truck and turned to Jax and held up the list. You really drove all of these today? He said. Yes, sir. All 47. Yes, sir. Whitaker looked at the list. He looked back at Jax. He let out a small, slow breath. Mr. Harlan, he said, I'm going to be honest with you. The county can't pre-position resources at 3 or 4 locations before the storm. We don't have the manpower and we don't have the budget and there isn't a process for it. I'd have to take it to the commissioners and they're not going to vote on it before Monday. The storm's going to hit Saturday. I know. Sir, what I can do is this. I can give your list to Stan Borchardt, who runs our volunteer fire. Stan's a good man. Stan will look at this list and Stan will quietly call every name on it personally before Saturday morning and check on them. That's the most I can do through the official channel. That helps. Sir. And Mr. Harlan, sir. Off the official channel, whatever you're doing on your property to be ready, keep doing it. And if some of the names on this list end up at your place because they don't have anywhere else to be, I'm not going to know about it and I'm not going to come looking for them. And I'm going to be very glad in the privacy of my own home that you bought the Barnaby place when you did. Jax looked at him. Yes, sir, he said. Good night. Mr. Harlan. Good night. Sir. Whitaker got into his truck and drove away. Jax stood in the parking lot of the community centre with Smokey at his heel and the cold November wind moving around them. And across the parking lot he could see Conrad Hollister standing by his big black diesel pickup, with his son beside him, and the two of them were watching him. They were watching him with the relaxed, unhurried interest of men who had decided that he was a problem they were going to handle on their own schedule, and that they were going to enjoy the handling of it. Jax did not look away. Smokey's amber eyes were on Hollister's centre mass again, and the dog's low rumble was so deep in her chest that Jax could feel it more than hear it. Could feel it through the side of his right boot where her shoulder was pressed against his calf. Hollister got into his truck. Hollister's truck pulled out of the parking lot and onto Pine Street and away into the November dark. Jax stood for another long moment in the cold. Then he turned and walked back to the F-250, and Smokey moved at his heel, and he opened the passenger door for her, and she jumped up into the cab, and he closed the door, and he walked around to the driver's side, and he sat down behind the wheel, and he looked at the 85-cent paper map of the county he had bought at Tuck's hardware store the day before, and he made a small mark on it next to one of the addresses on his list, and he started the engine. He had 36 hours. He had 36 hours to get the cellar cleared and reinforced. He had 36 hours to get the camper trailer winterized. He had 36 hours to get the food stored, the water stored, the wood split, the lanterns filled, the generator wired, the chimney swept, the windows weatherproofed and the fence on the access road repaired. He had 36 hours to make 80 acres of dead orchard ready to shelter, if it came to it, an old woman and a child, and any portion of 47 addresses on a folded list in his shirt pocket who needed a place to be. He put the truck in gear. The dog beside him was steady. The dog beside him was always steady. He drove home through the cold, dark. The first hard frost came in at 3 in the morning on Friday, and it came in white and absolute, the way the deep frosts come in the high country, settling onto the dead grass of the orchard and the roof of the camper trailer and the windshield of the F-250, and the broken shingles of the old barn, and it settled also onto Jax Harlan's hair and beard and jacket cuffs as he stood by the open mouth of the root cellar with a kerosene lantern in one hand and a long-handled pry bar in the other, and it settled onto Smoky, who lay on her belly at the lip of the cellar opening with her forepaws crossed and her amber eyes fixed steadily on the dark hole below them. The cellar was older than the orchard. The cellar was older than anything else on the property. He had known that from the moment he had pulled the rotted wooden hatch off it on the second day he had owned the place, because the stones that lined its walls had been cut by hand and laid by hand in a manner that had not been the standard practice in this part of the country since some time before the turn of the previous century, and the heavy timbers that supported its earth and shingle roof had been hewn from a single old-growth fir that no surveyor today would have been able to find anywhere in the valley. The cellar was 16 feet long and 12 feet wide and just under 7 feet deep, and it had been dug into the side of the rise that ran up behind the barn, and its mouth opened toward the south, so that the winter sun, in the brief midday hours that any winter sun reached this particular slope, would warm its threshold and bake it dry. He had been working the cellar for 31 hours straight. He had cleared the rotted shelving out. He had hauled 3 pickup loads of mouse-eaten newspaper and rusted preserve jars and what had once been 50-pound sacks of seed corn out into the old burn pile behind the barn. He had rebuilt the shelving along the north and east walls with new rough-cut pine boards from Tuck's. Set on iron brackets, he had bolted directly into the old hand-cut stone. He had run a doubled rope along the ceiling and lashed 2 hurricane lanterns to it and preloaded each lantern with kerosene. He had laid a 4x8 plywood platform along the floor against the south wall, and onto the platform he had laid 2 surplus military cots and 4 heavy wool blankets, and a small Coleman propane heater that he had taught himself to operate from the manual the previous afternoon, because he did not trust himself to operate it from memory. He had stocked the shelves. The shelves now held 40 cans of soup and 20 pounds of dry beans and the 50 pounds of rice and 4 gallons of bottled water, and a metal box of Strike Anywhere matches, and a first aid kit he had assembled himself from VA surplus, and a small battery-powered weather radio that he had tuned to the National Weather Service frequency and tested twice. He stood now at the cellar mouth and looked down into the lantern-lit dim of it and made his careful internal accounting, and concluded that, all things considered, he had built a place where 2 people and a child and a dog could sit out 3 days of weather without coming to harm. He turned and walked back toward the camper trailer. The camper trailer sat 50 feet from the cellar mouth, in the lee of the old barn, with its propane tank topped off, and its narrow stovepipe smoking faintly, and the small generator he had bought from Roy Tucker chained and tarped to a fence post beside it. The camper was 19 years old and was a single-axle pull-behind with a cracked vinyl floor and a bed barely long enough for him to lie flat in, and it was the second piece of property Jax Harlan owned in the world, and it was where he had been sleeping for the last 4 nights since the temperatures had dropped past the point where the cab of the F-250 was any longer reasonable. Smoky padded along beside him through the white frost. Her breath ghosted out of her muzzle in slow, steady pulses. The frost crunched beneath both their feet. The high pines on the slope above the orchard stood absolutely still in the cold, every branch outlined in white, every needle silvered, and the sky above them was a hard, glittering pre-dawn black with stars in it that had the quality of distance the high-altitude stars take on when the air is dry enough and cold enough. He went into the camper and lit the small kerosene heater and put the percolator coffee pot on the propane burner. And while the coffee brewed, he sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and let his hands rest on his knees and let the heat begin to work its way back into his fingers, and he closed his eyes for what he intended to be no more than 30 seconds. He saw the road outside the village. He did not see it as a memory. Memory was not what this was. This was the thing the VA counselor in Boise had explained to him 3 years ago now in the office with the wilted spider plant, the thing called intrusion. The thing that happened when a man's body was tired enough and his guard was lowered enough that the broken part of his mind threw a piece of footage onto the inside of his eyelids without warning and without consent. He saw the road. He saw the lead vehicle. He saw the half-second of orange flash. He saw the way the dust came up. He opened his eyes. The percolator was burbling. His hands were shaking. They were shaking only at the fingertips. They were shaking the way they had learned to shake, contained and small, in a way that nobody who was not looking for it would have noticed. He laid his palms flat on his knees and pressed down against the shake and counted, slowly, to 12. Smokey was watching him from the doorway of the camper. She had not come in. She was lying down across the threshold in the way she sometimes lay across the threshold, her body in the cold and her amber eyes inside. And her tail thumped, exactly once, when his eyes met hers. "I'm all right, Sergeant," he said. The tail thumped again. He poured the coffee into the steel surplus mug. He drank it standing up in the small camper kitchen, looking out the small frost-edged window at the grey pre-dawn beginning over the orchard, and he gave himself exactly 4 minutes in which to do nothing but drink the coffee and feel the heat of it move down his throat into his belly. The 4 minutes was a discipline. The 4 minutes was the old hard discipline of a man who had been taught in another life that the minutes a soldier did not give himself, the soldier eventually paid for at compound interest. He gave himself the 4 minutes. He finished the coffee. He set the mug down. He went back outside. The work of Friday began. He worked the orchard until full daylight, marking dead trees with red ribbon and live trees with blue, walking the long rows with Smokey pacing slowly behind him, getting his arms around the inventory of what was coming. He worked the access road from full daylight until 11, with the chainsaw and a come-along, clearing 2 large fallen pines that had been sitting across the lower switchback for so long that they had moss on them. He worked the barn from 11 until 2, throwing tarps over the worst of the roof holes and securing them with cinder blocks and rope. He worked the well housing from 2 until 3, wrapping the exposed pipe with heat tape and insulation. He worked the camper itself from 3 until 4, banking the snow skirt around its base with bales of hay he had bought from the feed store woman who had finally rung up his order without asking him 3 times whether he could pay for it. At 4 in the afternoon. Friday, he started on the drainage trench. The drainage trench was the piece of work he had been postponing for 2 days because he had hoped that the small culvert under the access road, the culvert that took the spring snowmelt off the slope behind the barn and ran it down through the orchard to the creek, would prove on closer inspection to be passable. He had finally walked it that morning with a flashlight and concluded it was not. The culvert was packed with 60 years of leaf litter and 2 dead raccoons and a length of old fence wire that had fallen into it in some forgotten storm. And if the snow that was projected to fall on Saturday and Sunday melted in any appreciable quantity at any point during the week after the storm, the culvert was going to back up and the meltwater was going to find a new path down the slope, and the new path was going to run directly through the side of his barn and the side of his camper and the south-facing mouth of the cellar. He had decided to dig a relief trench. He had decided to dig it 60 feet long and 3 feet deep, running diagonally across the slope, to channel any meltwater away from the barn and the cellar and toward the north fence line. The ground was already half frozen. He had a single shovel and a pickaxe and the heavy iron pry bar and 4 hours of fading daylight. He started digging. The pickaxe came down on the frozen earth and the impact ran up through the handle into his elbows and shoulders, and he set his feet and brought it down again. And he brought it down again. And he brought it down again, and the rhythm of the work began to become the rhythm of the late afternoon, the steady chunk and pull, and Smokey lay on the frozen grass at the edge of the trench line he was working with her chin on her paws and her amber eyes on him, and she did not move except to follow him with her gaze as he worked his way down the line. The light began to fail at 5:15. He kept working. He had a headlamp on the cap of the camper, and he turned it on and pulled it down over his forehead, and the small bright cone of light fell on the half-frozen earth in front of him, and he kept working, and the chunk and pull went on, and the muscles in his lower back began to lock up the way they always locked up after the first 3 hours of any kind of digging, and he set his stance wider to compensate, and he kept working. At 5:48, the pickaxe came down and hit metal. Not stone. Not root. Metal. It was a small, hard ringing sound that came up the handle into his arms and stopped his breath cold for 1 whole second. And in that 1 whole second the broken part of his mind, which had been dormant since the 4-minute discipline at the percolator that morning, opened up and put a piece of footage on the inside of his eyelids that he had not asked for and could not refuse. The footage of a metal detector going off on the road outside the village in the half-second before the orange flash, and his entire body went rigid and he could not move, and he could not move, and he could not move. Smokey was beside him. He had not seen her stand up. He had not seen her cross the 6 feet between her resting place and the lip of the trench. She was simply suddenly there, pressed against his left calf with the full warm weight of her shoulder, and her head was up, and her amber eyes were on his face, and she was making the low, slow, continuous sound she made, the sound that was not a whine, and not a hum, and not quite a growl, the sound she had made in the field hospital in Kandahar with her bandaged hindquarter and her amber eyes on his face the whole time, the sound that was hers and his and belonged to no one else. He could not move. She pressed harder. She put her full 83 pounds of working dog into the side of his calf, and she did not stop the sound, and the sound went on, and the sound was a thread, and the thread had one end inside her and the other end inside him, and it ran between them across the long cold dark of the orchard, and it held him. He came back. He came back the way a diver comes back from a long way down, in stages, in pressure releases, and the headlamp was still on his forehead, and the small bright cone of light was still on the half-frozen earth in front of him, and his hands were locked white-knuckled around the handle of the pickaxe, and Smokey was pressed against his calf, and he could feel the slow, steady beat of her heart against the side of his leg. He let his hands open. The pickaxe fell. He sat down on the frozen earth at the edge of the trench, and Smokey climbed half into his lap the way she did sometimes, the way a dog of her size could climb half into the lap of a man her size, with her front quarters across his thighs and her great noble head laid against his chest, and he put his arms around her neck and pressed his face into the thick rough double coat of her shoulder, and he stayed there for what was, by the small cold count he was running in his head, somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes. The sound she had been making slowed and softened and finally stopped. His hands stopped shaking. The night was full dark around them. The small bright cone of the headlamp lay on the frozen earth. The wind, which had been picking up all afternoon, was moving in the high pines on the slope above the orchard now with a long low note that was different from the note it had carried earlier in the day. The note that meant the front edge of the storm was through the upper passes and was now perhaps 30 hours away. He breathed. He breathed all the way in and all the way out, the way he had been taught to breathe. And Smokey breathed with him. The long, slow, shared breath of two creatures who had been breathing each other's air for a very long time. After a while he stood up. He picked up the pickaxe. He looked down at the place where he had hit the metal. He bent and brushed the loose earth aside with his gloved hand, and the headlamp light caught a small dull glint, and he saw what it was. It was the corner of an old iron horseshoe. It had been buried perhaps 18 inches deep, in a place where some long-ago horse had thrown it, and it had been waiting in that place for somebody eventually to dig where the horse had been. He held the horseshoe in his gloved hand for a long moment under the headlamp. Smokey watched him. He put the horseshoe in his coat pocket. He picked up the pickaxe, and he kept digging, and he finished the trench at 11:17 that night, and he walked back to the camper through the dark with the dog at his heel, and he ate a can of cold beans standing up at the small kitchen counter, and he lay down on the narrow bed in his clothes, and Smokey lay down across the threshold of the camper door, and somewhere out in the high pines on the slope above the orchard, the wind was still moving with a long low note, and Jax Harlan slept 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was more than he had slept in any night since the road outside the village. Saturday morning at 6:15, with a colourless dawn coming up over the eastern ridge and the wind already moving steady at 20 miles an hour through the orchard, Eleanor Calloway's old grey Subaru came up the access road with its headlights cutting through the half-light, and the boy Wyatt was in the passenger seat, and the back of the Subaru was loaded with blankets and canned goods, and a small green duffel, and a cardboard box of paperback books, and Eleanor got out, and Wyatt got out, and Jax met them at the bottom step of the camper, and Eleanor looked at his face in the grey morning, and she did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "Mr. Harlan, are you all right?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him. She did not say anything else. She and Wyatt and Jax carried the blankets and canned goods and duffel and books from the Subaru down into the cellar, and they made the bunks, and they laid the supplies on the new pine shelves, and Wyatt sat down on the lower cot with his small hands folded in his lap, and his small pale grey eyes on Smoky, who had taken up her position at the cellar mouth with her chin on her crossed paws, and Eleanor stood beside Jax in the lantern light, and she looked around the carefully made space and she said very quietly, "My Samuel would have built it just like this." "Yes, ma'am." The first snowflakes began to fall at 11 that morning. By 2 in the afternoon, the snow was sideways. By 6 in the evening, the power went out in the valley. The radio behind Roy Tucker's counter at Tuck's hardware store, and the radio in the kitchen of the White House with the tin roof, and the radio in Conrad Hollister's truck, and every radio in every house in every hollow of the valley went silent at 6:04 p.m. Saturday. And out in the orchard the wind in the high pines was no longer making the long low note it had been making the night before, was now making a sound that had no note at all, was making the white howling absence of sound that the worst storms make, and Jax Harlan stood at the cellar mouth with his weather radio in his hand and his German shepherd at his heel, and he watched the white wall come over the western ridge and bear down on the valley with a speed that no one in the community centre on Pine Street the previous Thursday evening had been willing to project. The storm was here. The storm did to the orchard what storms do to dead orchards. It came over the western ridge in a single white wall, and it laid into the trees with sustained winds that the National Weather Service would later officially log at 63 miles per hour with gusts measured at 81. And it brought with it snow that fell at the rate of 2 inches per hour for the first 6 hours of the event, and it brought temperatures that dropped from 28 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 in the afternoon to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight, and it brought a darkness that was not the darkness of night, but the darkness of a sky that had stopped distinguishing itself from the ground. In the cellar beneath the rise behind the barn, Eleanor Calloway sat on the lower cot with Wyatt against her side, and a heavy wool blanket across both of their laps, and the small Coleman propane heater hissed quietly beside the plywood platform, and the 2 hurricane lanterns lashed to the ceiling rope swayed slightly in the small movements of air that came down through the cellar's earth and shingle roof. And the boy was reading, very slowly and very carefully, from one of the paperback books his grandmother had brought from the White House, and Eleanor's pale grey eyes were on the boy's face, and her thin, strong hand was resting on the blanket between them, and she was not saying anything. Jax sat on the lower step of the cellar entrance. He had the cellar door propped open 6 inches, so that he could see out into the white howl of the storm, and the cold came in through the 6 inches and laid across his face and his beard, and the cuffs of his military surplus jacket, and Smoky lay on the dirt floor at his feet, with her amber eyes on the slice of white that was visible through the propped open door, and her nose was working, slow and steady, taking in the storm, reading whatever a dog of her training and breeding could read in a storm of that size. It was 9:47 in the evening. The storm had been going for 10 hours. The first 6 hours had been the worst the valley had seen since 1996. The next 3 hours had been the worst the valley had seen since 1962. The last hour had been the worst the valley had seen since records had begun to be kept in 1894, and the records would later show that the storm of November 14th and 15th was a once-in-130-year event, and the records would further show that it killed 3 people in 3 counties, and that all 3 of those people died in their own homes alone of cold. Smoky stood up. She did not stand up the way she stood up to ask to be let outside. She did not stand up the way she stood up to greet someone. She stood up the way she had stood up exactly twice in the 9 years Jax had owned her, which was to say she stood up, with her shoulders squared and her ears forward, and her amber eyes fixed on the propped open cellar door, and her tail held in a single long horizontal line. And a small low rumble began in the deep of her chest that was not a growl and was not a bark, and was the sound she made when she had identified with her training and her breed and her bone-deep professional certainty, a thing that was going to require her professional response. Jax went still. He had been resting his chin on his joined hands. He had been thinking in a slow, distant way about the temperature drop and about whether the camper trailer's water lines were going to hold. and he had not been ready to read a signal off the dog because no signal had been expected. The signal landed on him and he was ready in the next half-second, the way a soldier becomes ready, with the body before the mind, and his hand was already on the wool of her shoulder and his eyes were already on the propped open door. "What is it?" "Sergeant," he said quietly. Smokey did not look at him. She looked at the door. The low rumble continued. Eleanor had lifted her eyes from Wyatt. She had laid her hand on the boy's blanket and stilled him. And the boy had stopped reading. And the small dim cellar with its 2 swaying lanterns and its hissing heater had gone absolutely quiet, except for the storm outside and the rumble in Smokey's chest. "Jax," said Eleanor. "I see her, ma'am." "What does she want?" "I'm trying to figure that out." Smokey took 2 steps toward the cellar door. She stopped at the threshold. She turned her head and looked just once, and just briefly back over her shoulder at Jax, and the look in her amber eyes was the look she had given him in the field hospital in Kandahar when the medical officer had come in with the discharge paperwork, and it was the look she had given him in the parking lot of the courthouse in Spokane on the day the divorce had finalized. And it was the look she had given him every single one of the 11 mornings he had been alive on the orchard. And the look meant exactly one thing, the same thing it had always meant, the thing that ran beneath all the other things she ever communicated to him, the bedrock thing. "Stay with me." Then she went out the door. She went out fast. She did not hesitate at the threshold, and she did not pause to navigate the snow that was banked 3 feet deep against the cellar entrance. She pushed into the snow and through it and was, in the next 2 seconds, gone from sight in the white howling dark. "Smokey," Jack said. There was no answer except the storm. He stood up. "Eleanor," he said, "stay here. Keep the boy warm. Keep the heater running. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, do not come looking. Do you understand me?" "Ma'am." Eleanor Calloway looked at him in the swaying lantern light. "I understand you." "Mr. Harlan." 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Wyatt? The boy looked up. "Listen to your grandmother." The boy nodded. Jax pulled the heavy military surplus parka down off the peg by the cellar door and zipped it. And he pulled the wool watch cap down over his ears. And he pulled the leather choppers onto his hands. And he pushed the propped open door wide and stepped out into the storm. The storm took him. It took him the way the storms in the high country take a man, which is to say it tried in the first 3 seconds to reorient his entire body. The wind hit him broadside from the west and drove him a step and a half sideways before he set his stance and braced into it, and the snow drove against his face like sand, and his eyes watered, and the watering froze on his lashes, and he wiped the freezing water off with the cuff of the chopper and squinted into the white, and he could see perhaps 8 feet in any direction. There was no visible track of the dog. He had not expected one. The wind was filling tracks in real time. He had expected to use his ears and his other available knowledge, which was the knowledge of where on this property Smokey would have gone when she went, and he stood for the count of 3 at the cellar entrance with his face into the wind, and he listened. He heard, beneath the howl, a sound that was barely a sound. It was the sound of a dog digging. It was coming from the direction of the orchard. Specifically, it was coming from the direction of the 3rd row, 4th tree, the cleft tree, the apple tree he had laid his hand against on his 11th morning on the property, and stood beside in the grey light of dawn and thought about his wife. He moved. He moved through the snow with the heavy stride of a man who had been trained to move through hostile terrain in poor visibility, picking his footing by the small undulations beneath the white, working toward the sound. The drifts came up to his thighs. The wind drove against his right side. The snow drove against his face. He kept moving. He counted his paces. At pace 42 he saw the dark shape of the cleft tree rising out of the white. At pace 46 he saw the dark shape of his dog at the foot of it. She was digging. She had cleared a hole in the snow at the base of the cleft tree, perhaps 3 feet across, and perhaps 18 inches deep, and she was digging into the frozen earth beneath the snow, with the steady pneumatic rhythm of a working dog who had identified her target and intended to reach it, and the snow she was throwing up behind her was being taken instantly by the wind and carried away. And she was not stopping, and she was not slowing, and she was not looking up. Jax crouched beside her. "Sergeant," she did not look at him. She was making a sound now. It was not the rumble. It was a higher, more intent, working sound. The small, focused breath and grunt sound she made when she was on a task that had her full attention. And her front paws were moving in a coordinated, steady, alternating rhythm. And her hindquarters were braced, and there was already a faint trace of pink in the snow at the edge of her dig that meant she had torn a pad on something and that she did not care. He looked down into the hole. The frozen earth at the bottom of the hole had been laid open by her digging in a way that frozen earth does not normally lay open to a dog, and he could see, in the pale grey-white light bouncing off the snow around them, the thing she had been digging toward. It was the corner of something. It was wood, very old wood, banded with iron, and the iron had been corroded by 130 winters into the deep red-black colour of old blood. And the wood beneath the iron was so dark with age and with peat, and with the slow patient work of the soil, that it was almost the colour of the iron itself, and the corner of the thing was the corner of a chest. A chest. Jax went still. The wind was howling around him. The snow was driving against his face. His dog was standing in the bottom of the hole she had dug, with her amber eyes on the corner of the buried thing she had brought him to, and her sides were heaving, and her tongue was hanging from the corner of her muzzle, and there was pink in the snow beneath her paw, and she was looking at him with an expression that, if he had not known better, he would have said was almost amused. "Sergeant," he said quietly. She wagged her tail. "Once. You have been keeping secrets?" "Sergeant." She wagged her tail. "Once." He took the small folding shovel off the back of his belt where he kept it, and he climbed down into the hole beside her, and he began to clear the frozen earth around the corner of the chest with the kind of careful, methodical care that an archaeologist might have used, except that he had 10 minutes of his own air and no one else's, and a storm at 63 miles per hour over his head, and an old woman and a child in a cellar 200 feet behind him, counting his minutes for him. The chest was not large. The chest was perhaps 2 feet long and 15 inches wide and 10 inches deep, and as he cleared the earth around it he saw that it had been wrapped before burial in a layer of waxed canvas that had survived in part, and rotted in part, and been replaced over the decades by the slow black peat of the orchard soil, and the iron banding ran in 3 straps around its body, and the iron lock at its front had rusted shut, perhaps a century ago, and the wood was black with age, but the wood was, he could tell with the quick assessing knock of his gloved knuckle, intact. He laid the folding shovel down. He worked his hands beneath the body of the chest. The chest was heavier than he had expected. The chest was, by the lift of it, perhaps 40 pounds. He braced his knees and his lower back, and he heaved, and the chest came free of the earth that had held it for 130 Idaho winters, and he set it on the snow at the lip of the hole, and he climbed up out of the hole after it, and Smoky climbed up after him, and the 2 of them stood in the howling white over the chest she had brought him to. He picked it up. He carried it back across the orchard in the storm, with Smoky moving at his hip the way she moved at his hip when she was bringing a casualty back from a forward position, the way she had moved at his hip on the morning of the road outside the village, and he counted his paces, and at pace 112, he came back out of the white at the cellar entrance, and Eleanor Calloway was standing at the propped open door with her hand on Wyatt's shoulder and her pale grey eyes very wide. "Inside." "Ma'am," he said. They got inside. He kicked the cellar door closed against the storm. He set the chest down on the plywood platform beside the cots. The lanterns swung. The Coleman heater hissed. Smoky sat down on the dirt floor beside the chest with her bleeding paw tucked under her, and her amber eyes on his face, and her chest rising and falling with the long, deep working breath of an animal who had finished her assignment. "Mr. Harlan," said Eleanor. "What in the name of God?" "She found it." "Ma'am." "She found it," said Eleanor. "Yes, ma'am. At the base of the cleft tree. About 3 feet down." "How did she know it was there?" "Ma'am," said Jax, I have stopped asking her how she knows things a long time ago. Eleanor sat down slowly on the lower cot. Wyatt had set his book aside. The boy was looking at the chest with his small pale face, very still and very serious, the way children look at things that they understand. Without being told to be serious, Jax took the leather choppers off. He laid them on the platform beside the chest. He took the wool watch cap off and set it on top of the choppers. He looked at the chest. The lock was rusted shut. He did not need to break the lock. He knelt beside the chest and worked the small folding knife out of his belt and slid the blade carefully along the seam between the lid and the body, and the iron banding had loosened in places with age, and the wood beneath the iron had given in places, and the lid lifted with a small dry whisper of old fibres parting, and the chest opened. Inside the chest there were, in order from top to bottom, a folded oilcloth, blackened at the edges with age, that had once been white. Beneath the oilcloth, a small leather-bound journal, perhaps 4 inches by 6, with brass corner caps and a brass clasp and a maker's mark stamped into the inside cover that read Cincinnati, Ohio, 1862. Beneath the journal, a folded letter in a yellowed envelope, addressed in careful copperplate handwriting to Mrs. Mary Barnaby of Boise City, Idaho Territory. Beneath the letter, a small velvet pouch, drawn closed with a faded red silk ribbon, which when Jax opened it spilled into his gloved palm a pair of gold wedding rings, a gold locket on a fine gold chain, and a small gold and pearl brooch in the shape of a flower. Beneath the velvet pouch, a flat tin biscuit box, on the lid of which was painted, in faded red and gold, a picture of a stag at sunset, and which, when Jax opened it, contained 183 United States Liberty Head double eagle gold coins dated between 1854 and 1888, stacked in neat columns of 9 and held in place by small folded squares of wax paper. Beneath the biscuit box, wrapped in another piece of oilcloth, a small dark object that turned out, when Jax unwrapped it, to be a brass dog collar, much worn, with a small brass tag attached to it on a brass ring. The brass tag read, in letters worn smooth by what must once have been the constant rub of a working dog's neck against it, Sergeant Q,
C-O-O,
C, 12 THPA, Cav, with Elias Barnaby, 1A62-1879. Jax held the brass tag in his bare hand for a long moment. Eleanor was leaning forward. Wyatt was leaning forward. Smokey had stood up and come over and was standing at Jax's elbow, and her cold black nose was pressed against the back of his bare hand where the brass tag lay, and her amber eyes were on the tag, and the great noble head of her did not move. "Mr. Harlan," said Eleanor very softly, "whose was that dog?" "Ma'am," said Jax. He did not trust his voice. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, there was a man in the Civil War named Elias Barnaby. He served with the 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He had a war dog whose name was Sergeant. They came home together in 1865. He paused. He looked down at the tag in his palm, and then, I think they came here. He looked up. Eleanor was looking at him. Wyatt was looking at him. Smokey was looking at him. Outside, the storm was howling at 63 miles per hour. Inside, the small Coleman heater was hissing, and the 2 hurricane lanterns were swaying, and Jax Harlan picked up the small leather-bound journal with the brass clasp, and he sat down on the lower cot beside Eleanor Calloway and across from her grandson Wyatt, and he opened the journal to the first page, and he began to read, in the lantern light, what a man named Sergeant Elias Barnaby had written there in the winter of 1865, when he had come home from his war, and had been told by his country that there was no place for him in it. The boy on the cot moved closer. Eleanor's hand came to rest on Jax's sleeve. The dog who had brought him to the chest lay down at his feet and put her chin on his boot and closed her amber eyes for the first time in 3 days. And she slept. Outside the storm howled. Inside, in the small dim cellar with its swaying lanterns and its hissing heater and its hand-cut century-old stone walls, Jax Harlan read the words of a man 161 years dead and felt, for the first time since the road outside the village, that he was not alone in the country he had served. The journal was 42 pages long, and Sergeant Elias Barnaby had filled all 42 of them in the same careful copperplate hand, and the entries ran from the 1st of November 1865 to the 8th of February 1889, which was a span of 23 years and 3 months. And Jax Harlan read the journal aloud by lantern light in the cellar through the long howling night of the storm, with Eleanor Calloway beside him, and the boy Wyatt across from him, and the dog Smokey asleep on his boot. And, when he had finished reading, they sat for a long time in silence, and listened to the wind in the high pines on the slope above the orchard, and did not say anything. The journal told a story. It told the story of a man who had ridden out of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1862, with a horse and a sabre, and a Federal carbine and a young bloodhound named Sergeant, who had been given to him by his uncle the morning of his enlistment, and who had ridden with the 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry across 4 states, and through 11 engagements over the next 3 years, and who had taken a Confederate ball through his right thigh at the Second Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864, and had ridden 11 miles back to his lines with the bloodhound running alongside his stirrup, and who had been mustered out at the end of the war in the summer of 1865 with the wound and the dog, and a paper from his commanding officer that said he had been a good soldier. It told the story of his coming home. It told the story of a young wife named Mary who had waited for him for 3 years, and who had embraced him on the platform of the Carlisle station, and who had taken him home to a small farm outside of town where his father had died while he was away, and where the bank had foreclosed during his absence, and where he had stood for a long moment in the empty front room, and had understood, slowly, that the country he had bled for had not waited for him the way Mary had. It told the story of the move west. It told the story of Mary and Elias and Sergeant the Bloodhound travelling by train and by stagecoach, and finally by wagon to Boise City, Idaho Territory, in the spring of 1866, where Elias had used the small federal pension that his wound entitled him to, and the savings Mary had managed to put together from her work as a seamstress during the war years to buy 80 acres of poor, unloved land north of a small mining camp that would eventually grow into the town that Jax Harlan had walked through 11 days before. And on those 80 acres he had planted his apple trees one by one over the next 8 years. And he had built the small house that had stood until the 1950s when it had finally collapsed in on itself. And he had built the cellar with his own hands out of stones he had hauled from the creek. And he had built the barn that still stood with its broken roof above the place where Jax was sitting reading. It told the story of Mary's death. It told that story in 3 sentences. The 3 sentences were, in their entirety: Mary went to her rest on the 11th of June, in the 8th year of our work on this place. The fever took her in 5 days. I have buried her on the south slope, where the morning sun reaches first. It told the story of Elias and Sergeant going on alone. It told that story over the next 30 pages. It told of the orchard coming into bearing in 1875, of the first commercial harvest in 1878, of the years of slow, steady work, of the storms that had taken trees, of the new trees Elias had planted to replace the ones the storms had taken, of the gold rings that Mary had left him, and the small inheritance from Mary's people in Pennsylvania that had arrived in 1881, and that Elias had converted, on advice he did not trust, into Liberty Head double eagle coins which he had kept in a tin biscuit box under the floorboards of the house. It told of the slow gathering of a small fortune. It told of the mining men from town who came up the access road in 1884 and offered to buy the orchard for a price Elias had described in his careful copperplate hand, as a sum so far below the value of the labour I have invested in this soil that I understood the offer to be not a transaction but an insult. It told of Elias Barnaby refusing the offer. It told of the men from town coming back the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, with bigger offers and more elaborate insults, and of Elias Barnaby refusing them every time. and of the bloodhound sergeant standing at Elias Barnaby's heel through every encounter the way Smokey had stood at Jax Harlan's heel in the hardware store the previous Tuesday. It told of the bloodhound sergeant dying on the 18th of October 1879 at the age of 17 years. It told of Elias Barnaby burying the bloodhound on the south slope, beside Mary, in the place where the morning sun reached first. It told of the next 10 years. Those 10 years were the hardest part of the journal to read aloud. Those 10 years were the years of a man alone on 80 acres in the high country, with his wife in the ground and his dog in the ground, and the men from town still coming up the road every spring with their offers. And the entries grew shorter and slower and more sparse, and the copperplate hand grew by small fractions less steady. And on the 8th of February 1889 the final entry was made, and it read in its entirety, "I am going to bury what remains of our work in the place beneath the cleft apple tree, where Sargent used to lie of summer afternoons. If a man comes to this property who is the kind of man who would dig where a good dog has chosen to lie, then he is the kind of man who has earned what he finds. To that man, whoever he may be, and to whatever good dog has brought him here, I leave the work of this orchard, and I commend it to his care. And I ask only that he remember that the soil keeps faith with those who keep faith with it." Elias Barnaby had died alone in his house on the orchard sometime between the 9th of February and the 23rd of February 1889. The county records, which Jax would later look up at the courthouse, would show that his body had been found by a feed store delivery man on the 23rd, in his bed, with no signs of struggle, of natural causes connected to the gunshot wound he had taken at Cold Harbor 25 years before. He had been 61 years old. He had been buried by the county on the south slope of his own orchard, in the place where his wife and his bloodhound were already buried, and the property had passed to a distant cousin in Pennsylvania who had never set foot on it, and the cousin had let the back taxes accumulate, and the property had been sold at auction in 1892, and it had passed through 11 owners over the next 134 years, none of whom had ever lived on it for longer than 4 years, and none of whom had ever brought it back, and the most recent of whom had been an investment trust in Spokane that had finally given up on it and listed it for $41,000 cash to anybody fool enough to buy it. Jax closed the journal at 3:47 in the morning of November the 15th. He sat on the lower cot in the lantern light with the closed journal in his hands, and he did not say anything for a long time. Eleanor was crying. She was crying the way old women cry, which is to say silently, with the tears running steadily down the lines of her face and falling onto her clasped hands in her lap. She did not wipe them. She did not seem to know they were there. Wyatt had fallen asleep against her side at some point during the reading. The boy's small head was tucked into the crook of her arm. Smokey was still asleep on Jax's boot. Outside the cellar, the wind in the high pines on the slope above the orchard was beginning, by small fractions, to slacken. The storm was passing. The storm had gone over the valley and was now moving east into Montana, and behind it was coming the deep windless cold that always came behind such storms in the high country, the cold that would hold the valley for the next 4 days. Jax laid the journal on the platform beside the open chest. "Ma'am," he said. Eleanor wiped her face on her sleeve. "Mr. Harlan." "Ma'am, I would like to walk up to the south slope when it's light, with your permission and the boys'. I would like to look for the place he wrote about." Eleanor nodded. "I would like to come with you," she said. The light came up at 7:12. The storm had laid down 31 inches of snow on the orchard, and the snow was glittering hard under a sky that was the deep, cold blue that comes only after such storms, and Jax and Eleanor and Wyatt walked up the south slope of the property with the dog at their heel, and the snow was hip-deep on the boy and waist-deep on Eleanor, and Jax broke trail for them, and they moved slowly, and after 20 minutes they came to the place where the slope levelled into a small flat shelf, perhaps 30 feet across that faced east, and where, beneath the snow, Jax could feel with his boot the slight regular rises of 3 small mounds. He cleared the snow off the first mound with his gloved hand. There was a stone. The stone was small and roughly cut, and the lettering on it was almost worn away. but the lettering was still legible in the morning light, and the lettering said, Mary Barnaby 1841-1874 beloved. He cleared the second mound. The second stone said Elias Barnaby SGT 12 PHPACA 281889. He cleared the third mound. The third stone said only Sergeant 1062 10879, good dog. Smoky walked over to the third stone. She did not paw it. She did not sniff it. She did in a way that Jax had seen her do exactly once before in the 9 years he had owned her. Lower her great noble head and lay her muzzle for a long moment against the top of the worn small stone, and her amber eyes closed, and she stood that way for what was, by Jax's quiet count, perhaps 14 seconds. And then she lifted her head and turned and came back to his heel, and she sat down beside him in the snow. Eleanor was crying again. Wyatt had taken her gloved hand. Jax stood for a long time looking at the 3 small worn stones in the deep cold morning sun. Ma'am, he said finally, I'd like to plant a sapling here in the spring. On the dog's mound. And one on the wife's mound. And I'd like to leave the man's mound alone, because I think he would have wanted his trees over the people he loved and not over himself. Eleanor nodded. Mr. Harlan, she said, if I may, I would like to help you do that. Yes, ma'am. They walked back down the slope. At 9:47 that morning, while Jax was on the radio to Carl Whittaker, giving him the report of his property and offering whatever help his cellar and his stored food and his generator could provide to the addresses on his list that needed it most, Conrad Hollister's big black diesel pickup came up the access road at the head of a small black Mercedes SUV, and the 2 vehicles parked at the foot of the path to the camper, and Conrad Hollister got out of the pickup, and a man in a long charcoal overcoat got out of the SUV, and the 2 of them came up the path through the snow. Jax met them at the cellar mouth. Smoky was at his heel. Eleanor was at the cellar door behind him, with her arm around Wyatt. Mr. Harlan, said Hollister, smiling. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. I hope we're not catching you at a bad time. I heard from Carl Whittaker that you had a productive night. This is Mr. Stephen Albright, of Albright and Hess in Boise. Stephen represents my interests on a number of land matters in the valley. The lawyer smiled politely. Mr. Hollister, said Jax. Mr. Albright. Mr. Harlan, said Hollister, word travels fast in a small valley. I understand that during last night's events your dog uncovered an item of historical interest on your property. A buried item. An item that, depending on certain legal questions, may have implications for the title to the orchard, given that the item was buried prior to the most recent recorded transfer of the property, and was not disclosed in that transfer. I'm here this morning, Mr. Harlan, because I want to make sure you have access to good counsel as you work through those questions. I want to make you a final and very generous offer for the property, one that takes into account, in good faith, the as yet unverified value of the item your dog uncovered. Stephen has the paperwork. The lawyer opened the leather portfolio. Jax did not look at it. Mr. Hollister, he said. Mr. Harlan, the item my dog uncovered last night belonged to Sergeant Elias Barnaby of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Sergeant Barnaby served with distinction in the 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry from 1862 to 1865. He was wounded at Cold Harbor. He came west with his wife Mary and his war dog Sergeant. He bought these 80 acres in 1866. He worked them for 23 years. He buried his wife and his dog and his life savings on this property. He died alone in his bed in February of 1889, of complications from the wound he took at Cold Harbor. He left a journal that explicitly bequeaths the contents of the chest to whatever man eventually found them, on the condition only that they continue the work of the orchard. The journal is in my possession. The journal will be authenticated by the Idaho State Historical Society, to whom I will be making a complete photographic record of it available on Monday morning. The chest, the contents of the chest, and the title to this property are not, Mr. Hollister, available for any offer at any price, and they are not now, and they will never be. There was a long silence. The lawyer Albright closed his leather portfolio quietly. Conrad Hollister looked at Jax for a long moment. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "I think you are making a mistake." "Mr. Hollister," said Jax, "I have made many mistakes. This is not going to be one of them." Hollister looked at him. Hollister looked at Smokey, whose amber eyes were on his centre mass with the same calm professional attention they had been on his centre mass in Tuck's hardware store the previous Tuesday. Hollister looked at Eleanor and the boy at the cellar door. Hollister, who was many things but was not a stupid man, made a small calculation in his head and arrived at a small, reasonable conclusion. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "welcome to the valley." He turned and walked back down the path through the snow with his lawyer behind him, and they got into their vehicles and they drove away, and Jax stood at the cellar mouth with his dog at his heel, and his neighbours at his door, and the deep, cold blue sky over the orchard, and he watched them go, and he did not feel any particular triumph, and he did not feel any particular satisfaction, and what he felt instead was a thing he had not felt in 4 years and could not entirely name, the thing a man feels when something that was taken from him has been, by some unaccountable mercy, returned. Eleanor's hand came onto his shoulder. "Mr. Harlan," she said quietly. "Ma'am, my husband would have stood here this morning and said exactly what you just said, in exactly the same words. Ma'am, you are not invisible. Mr. Harlan, not any more, not in this valley. Not while I am alive in it." Jax did not trust his voice. He laid his hand on top of hers on his shoulder, and he let it stay there for the count of 4, and then he turned, and the 4 of them, the man and the woman and the boy and the dog, walked back down the path through the snow toward the cellar and the camper trailer, and the 80 acres of mission that had, over the course of 1 storm and 1 buried chest, and 136 years, finally and at last become a home. Spring came late to the valley that year. It came on the 30th of April, in a soft south wind that smelled of warming earth and of distant rain. And on that morning Jax Harlan walked up the south slope of the orchard with a small apple sapling balanced on his shoulder, and a long-handled spade in his hand, and his German shepherd at his heel, and Eleanor Calloway and Wyatt walked behind him with a second sapling between them, and the 3 of them and the dog stopped at the small flat shelf where the morning sun reached first. Jax dug. The earth was soft. The earth gave to the spade the way good earth gives in spring, the way earth gives to a man who has earned the right to plant in it. He set the sapling in the hole. He laid his bare hand against the trunk of it for a moment. He filled the hole with the rich, dark soil he had hauled up from the cellar slope, and he watered it from the metal pail he had set down beside him, and he stood back. He stood back and looked at the small new tree on the small old mound. Smokey walked over to the 3rd stone, the smallest of the 3, and she lay down beside it. She laid her great noble head on her crossed paws. Her amber eyes closed halfway in the spring sun. Eleanor was beside Jax. Wyatt was holding Jax's other hand. "Mr. Harlan," Eleanor said quietly, "the land remembers what people choose to forget." Jax did not answer. He did not need to. The wind moved through the orchard around them, and the apple trees, the ones that were coming back, were beginning to bud, and somewhere down the access road a vehicle was coming, slow and unhurried, the sound of a neighbour. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.